trying to set up my screen here, I'd like you to take, please, a pen and paper and very quickly write down your answer to this question. How would you define the word ethics? Don't overthink it. Whatever pops into your head, one sentence or less, just jot it right down. And now, if you would, please set that aside, and we'll come back to that in just a bit. Jewish folklore tells a story of a king who had a prodigal son, always misbehaving, always getting in trouble, never accepting rebuke, and an embarrassment to the king. And eventually the king had no choice but to send his son into exile. He banished him to a distant province. And when the prince arrived, he didn't know anyone, nobody knew him, he had no money, he had no skills, and the only way he could support himself was by taking a job as a lowly shepherd. It wasn't hard work, but in the summertime, the sun beat down mercilessly. In the wintertime, the wind and the rain cut through to his skin. And he looked and he saw the other shepherds all constructed little huts to protect them from the elements. So the prince tried to build himself a little hut, but he was so inept that as soon as he built it, it collapsed. And so he had to sit out, exposed to the elements, miserable day after day, and years went by until finally he heard that the king was going to be visiting his province. And there was a custom in the kingdom that when the king's entourage passed by, anyone could write a note with a little request, would ball it up, throw it, and if it landed in the king's carriage and the king picked it up, he would grant whatever requests he read. And so the prince said, this is his big chance. And he positioned himself along the parade route, and he had his note ready, balled up into a little ball. And as the king's carriage came by, he took careful aim and he threw it, and it landed right at the king's feet. The king picked up the note, opened it up, read it, and he burst into tears because he recognized that the note was from his son. And what did his son ask him for? A little hut to protect him from the sun and the wind and the rain. And the king wept because he said, my son has forgotten who he is. He doesn't know he's a prince anymore. We are all children of the king. That's where human nobility comes from. That's the divine spark that has brought us all here together to try to make the world a better place for others and for ourselves. When we forget that, it becomes the source of all our problems. When we remember it, it puts us on a path to success. It's interesting that Judaism has many parables, proverbs, folk tales, and a disproportionate number of them are about kings. Why? Because there are two types of leaders, kings and despots. A despot is nothing but a tyrant. His edicts can be irrational, capricious, with no concern for individual rights or the common welfare. Subjects serve a despot, but only out of fear, secretly waiting and wishing for another leader, another ruler to come and take his place. In contrast, a king, even though a king has absolute power, a king can be a benevolent dictator, ruling with enlightened wisdom, balancing justice and compassion in the way he guides his kingdom. And even though the king doesn't need the support of his people, if there'd be a vote, they would return the king to his throne by nearly unanimous consent. In the workplace, managers and bosses may have absolute power, but it's the way they wield that power that will determine the loyalty and, by natural consequence, the productivity of their employees. If you want to be seen and respected as a king and not reviled as a despot, you need to command, not demand, loyalty. And the way your people see you will depend on whether you conduct yourself according to the principles of ethics. When leaders lead with ethical awareness, they project a culture where their people are valued. See, culture flows downhill like water. And when leaders they take an interest, they have a respect, they act with ethics, that mindset percolates through their organization and permeates the culture. And the way to acquire an ethical mindset is by cultivating the qualities of ethical leadership. So let me ask you right now, what is one quality that you admire most in a leader? Please type your answer into the chat. Let's have a look. One quality you admire most in a leader. Trust. Excellent. Empathy. Very good. Fairness, integrity, love, authenticity. I'm with you. Now, what should be obvious is that the more of these qualities leaders acquire, the more others will want to follow them. The sages teach us that there are three crowns: the crown of monarchy, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of scholarship. But the sages teach there is one crown that surpasses them all, and that is the crown of a good name. And how do we acquire a good name? By acquiring ethical character. My own journey to discover the wisdom of the sages began over 35 years ago. I had just graduated from the University of California, and I took my degree in English and I put it to good use by going hitchhiking across the United States. I did that for half a year, and then I crossed the Atlantic, went backpacking across Europe, until 1 year later I found myself in the land of Israel, where through an unlikely series of events, I ended up in a rabbinic college. Now, if you don't know what that is, neither did I. But what I found there caught me completely by surprise. 3,000 years of wisdom, generations upon generations of insight into human nature and the human condition that can all be summed up in one word: ethics. What are ethics? That was the question I asked before we began. So if you would, please type into the chat the answer that you wrote down in the beginning. A very short definition of ethics. What do you have? Perspective, social responsibility, knowing right from wrong, set of principles that guides behavior leading to the highest performance. Excellent. Doing the right thing, value-based, very good. Morals and principles, decisions about actions that portray love to others. I like that. Social responsibility and civics, excellent, thank you. Now, presumably we should be able to take all of these ideas, being transparent, and consolidate them, condense them into a single concise definition. I'd like to propose to you the following: that we can define ethics as the discipline of recognizing and taking responsibility for the impact our actions have on others. And the way we take responsibility is by recognizing that character is not something you're born with, it's something you work for. We live in a society that would try to convince you that you have to choose between being good and being successful. Nothing could be farther from the truth. And statistics bears this out. If you compare the employees who work for companies ranked in the lowest 25% for trust with employees who work for companies in the top 25%, that top 25, they report having twice as much energy on the job, being 76% more engaged, being 50% more productive, and 50% more likely to stay in their jobs. They enjoy their jobs 60% more, are 70% more aligned with their company's purpose. They're 41% less likely to depersonalize coworkers, and 40% less prone to experience burnout. What's more, the most ethical companies are more productive and more profitable, and they grow faster than companies that aren't. You see, it all comes down to this: good ethics is good business. That is the 3,000-year-old secret I'm here to share with you. In this half hour, I hope you'll discover a way to create a healthy and vibrant work culture that builds trust, inspires loyalty, generates passion, and drives productivity. And in the time we have together, what I intend to do is show you the 6 essential qualities of an ethical leader and give you a an action plan for transforming your team into a model of ethical idealism. Now, I don't know if it's still true, but back in my day, you couldn't make it through childhood without having seen Cecil B. DeMille's iconic film, The Ten Commandments. As a work of history or theology, it leaves a little bit to be desired, but it does provide a very powerful dramatization of a narrative that is a psychological profile of ethical courage. So let's take a look. And so it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown up that he went out among his brethren and looked on their burdens. He went out among his brethren. Think about that. Growing up as a prince in Egypt, as a grandson in the house of Pharaoh, Moses could easily have looked down on the Jews as a people to be despised and enslaved, but he didn't. He looked at them as brothers and sisters. His heart went out to them. He was appalled by the conditions under which they worked and lived, so much so that when he saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his brethren, he looked this way and that, and when he saw that there was no one there, he killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. What did Moses think he was going to accomplish? There were literally millions of Jews suffering from Egyptian oppression. Was he going to change the system? Was he going to relieve anyone's suffering? Wouldn't another Egyptian simply take the place of the one he killed? But Moses didn't stop to make those kinds of calculations. This was his brother. He couldn't just stand by and watch him suffer at the hands of injustice. He had to take action. Because the first quality that defines an ethical leader, as Kelly has already primed us to see, is empathy. The first step towards being ethical is to see situations and events through the eyes of others. Ethical leaders recognize the particular circumstances and challenges of their people so they can feel their joy and their pain. They can understand their hopes and their fears. They can be sensitive to their wants and their dreams. Empathy requires knowing others, and with that knowledge, you can anticipate the impact of your actions and decisions to ensure that your people always feel valued, respected, and appreciated. And you don't have to be Moses to do it. Have you ever witnessed an act of exceptional empathy? How did that make you feel? Examples of exceptional character inspire us to ask more from ourselves so that we can then inspire others. And the first question we can ask ourselves on a daily basis to develop our empathetic response is, what impact will my words and actions have on those around me? Asking that question every day will push our ethical response to a higher level. Now, let's continue with the story of Moses. After killing the Egyptian, Moses had to flee for his life into the desert. Eventually, he came to the land of Midian, where he met and married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, and for years worked tending his father-in-law's sheep. It was only after his revelation of the burning bush that Moses went back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh, charged by the Almighty with demanding that the people go free. But it seemed from the start that his mission was a failure. Pharaoh was so offended, so upset, angered at being told he had to release his slaves, that he decreed that they should be deprived straw, doubling their workload while insisting that they continue to meet their quota. And the foremen of the children of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten, saying, "Why have you not fulfilled your appointed task in making bricks?" The Egyptians assumed that the Jewish foremen would beat the Jewish laborers as they themselves were beaten, but they didn't. They took the beatings themselves and shielded the Jews from the brutality of Pharaoh and his overseers. And much later, after the Jews had gone out of Egypt and into the desert, and it was time to choose judges and officers, whom do you think they chose? According to rabbinic tradition, it was the same foremen who had protected them and not beaten them that were chosen to be their leaders. Because leaders can only lead effectively if they have the trust of the people they lead. And we trust no one so much as those who demonstrate that they put our welfare above their own. That's why trustworthiness is the second quality of an ethical leader. And it's more than just trustworthiness. It's the willingness to trust. Because if you don't trust me, why should I trust you? And second, because trust is empowering. It's ennobling. And it demonstrates a willingness to share responsibility for the benefit of the team or the group. Let me ask you, has someone ever earned or repaid your trust? How did that make you feel toward the other person? Type your answer into the chat. Didn't it make you feel empowered, loyal, committed? Didn't it give you a sense of partnership? We know that micromanaging doesn't work, but more than that, it's humiliating. Showing trust for others promotes a culture of mutual respect and a sense of collaboration. It raises employees from peons and assets to the level of partners and stakeholders. And that's why an ethical leader asks every day, do I trust others and have I earned their trust? Trust does not come easy. And unfortunately, after 210 years of Egyptian slavery, the Jewish people had serious trust issues. 40 days after Moses went up on Sinai to receive the law, a band of cynics convinced the others that Moses had died on the mountain, never to return. And while the people were panicking and bemoaning their fate, this band of miscreants insisted that they build an idolatrous image to take the place of Moses and pressured Aaron to construct the golden calf. Now, up until this point, the Almighty had been patient with the Jewish people's inability to trust the God who had taken them out of slavery, but this was an act of outright rebellion. And so, God says to Moses, I have seen these people, and behold, they are stiff-necked people. Now remove yourself from me, that my wrath shall burn, and I shall consume them, and I will make of you a great nation. Can you imagine if God said this to you? I've given up on this people, but I made a promise to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Moses will fulfill my promise through you, starting over and building up a new nation. You think Moses would give this some thought, at least for a couple of minutes? I mean, after all, the Jews have been questioning him and challenging his authority practically from the moment he arrived in Egypt. But what does Moses say back to God? And now will you please forgive their sin? And if not, I pray that you blot me out of your book, which you have written. Not only does Moses not accept being a father of a new nation, not only does he stand between the Almighty and the Jewish people, as it were, but he says, if you won't forgive them, erase me from the pages of history. It's for good reason that Scripture later testifies that Moses was the most humble person who ever lived. And indeed, the next quality of an ethical leader is humility. Pastor Rick Warren says that humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Moses knew he was the greatest prophet and leader of all time, but he also knew that his abilities and opportunities were God-given, and therefore his accomplishments, achievements didn't make him better than anyone else. When leaders see themselves as first among equals, they project an attitude that everyone matters, that everyone's contribution is valued, and that everyone shares the success of the team. Leadership is a gift and a privilege, one that carries with it responsibility. The best leaders recognize that they're not infallible, and they promote a culture by encouraging constructive disagreement. This produces deeper insight, greater clarity, and a culture of collaboration. Admitting when you're wrong or when you don't know does not make you look weak. It establishes credibility for the future when you have to assert that you are right and you do know. Have you ever witnessed a truly great person displaying great humility? How did that make you want to act? Isn't there something profoundly inspiring about extraordinary people who don't expect to be treated different from anyone else? And that's why ethical leaders ask themselves daily, am I interested in what benefits my community or in what benefits my prestige and my ego? Now, the pivotal moment in the life of Moses comes, of course, when he encounters the burning bush. There he is, tending his father-in-law's sheep, having a peaceful existence, and an angel of God appeared unto him in the flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside now and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And upon seeing that he turned aside to see, God called out to him of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. It's a deceptively simple narrative. But consider the amount of detail given to describe how Moses acted. First, he looked. Second, he turned aside. Third, he said, I will see. And fourth, he asked why. Moses did not simply observe an unusual event. He saw an angel of God appearing in a form that violated everything he understood about the nature of the world. And even so, he looked not passively, but purposefully. And even though he saw it was a great sight, not just an interesting phenomenon, but a transformational event, and still he turned aside to see, to investigate, to confront an unknown that would challenge him to reevaluate everything he took for granted about the world and his place in it. And by doing so, Moses demonstrates the next two qualities of an ethical leader: inquisitiveness and courage. Moses could have kept his distance and gazed at the spectacle from afar without making any effort to understand what it was or what it meant. But he turned to see, ready to face the truth and deal with the consequences, no matter what they would demand from him. You're all familiar with the famous definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result? So why do we do it? Because we're afraid. We're afraid of being wrong. We're afraid of being seen as being wrong. We're afraid of having to change the way of looking at the world with which we have become too comfortable. And the result of that fear is something called groupthink. We retreat into little enclaves of people who think just like us and refuse to entertain any ideas or notions that challenge our worldview. And that is a recipe for catastrophe. This is why diversity and inclusion are so important. According to Jewish law, when the High Court convened to hear a capital case, if all 23 justices agreed on a guilty verdict, they threw the case out of court and let the accused go free. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? But unconscious bias is not a new phenomenon. We are all products of our environment. And the more we limit our associations to people who are just like us, the more prone we become to ideological tunnel vision and the evils of groupthink. That's why, if there weren't at least one vote to convict, the sages questioned their own objectivity. They didn't trust their own judgment, and they felt they had no choice but to let the accused go free. But if there were at least a single dissenting vote, then they could have confidence that all the different angles had been investigated, that every possible argument had been made, confident enough to move forward. Paradoxically, it was the lack of unanimity that gave them confidence to apply the final irreversible verdict and sentence of execution. Because the more we all agree that the way forward is obvious, the more likely it is that we've overlooked some flaw in our own reasoning. That's why diversity and inclusion are about more than equal representation. They're about creating a culture of questioning, curiosity, and courage, one in which constructive disagreement is not only allowed, but required. A diverse culture forces us to confront questions that we don't even know we have. An inclusive culture makes it safe to ask and answer those questions. And so ethical leaders ask themselves, do I want to know as much as I can? Or do I want to look like I know it all? And they ask themselves, am I more afraid of looking wrong or of being wrong? Before Scripture presents the episode of the burning bush, it gives us this seemingly trivial detail that Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, and he led the flock to the farthest end of the wilderness. It's very interesting that almost all biblical leaders at some point were shepherds. Why? Because shepherds had plenty of time for self-reflection and introspection. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, no streaming, no videos, no one to talk to. They're just alone with their thoughts. And more than that, the shepherd is responsible for tending the best interest of the whole flock, but also making sure that every individual sheep is taken care of. And therefore, it's a perfect training ground for leadership, because leaders need to keep track of the big picture without losing track of the details for the people. And so, as a shepherd, there is no better place to learn the art of self-discipline, the final quality of ethical leaders. Ethical leaders ask themselves, what can I do to improve today so I can do my job better tomorrow? If we ask ourselves this question every day, then we will become people who demonstrate greater empathy, who are more trustworthy, who are truly humble, and naturally inquisitive, who are able to show great courage and live lives guided by continuous self-discipline. And if we do, then we will become people who are truly ethical, and we will become ethical leaders. And to be an ethical leader means to be a successful leader, to be a good shepherd, and to be a worthy child of the King.